Ideas promoted in various proposed textbooks, including the notion that Moses and Solomon inspired American democracy, that in the era of segregation only sometimes were schools for black children lower in quality, and that Jews viewed Jesus Christ as an important prophet. This was written by Valerie Strauss of the Washington Post around the issue of Texas textbooks, Modern and Distorting Facts of American History. This issue does not only exist in Texas, but many places in the U.S. As Valerie Strauss continues, scholarly reviews of 43 proposed history, geography, and government textbooks for grades 6 to 12, undertaken by Education Fund of Texas Freedom Network, a watchdog and activist group that monitors far-right issues and organizations, found extensive problems in American government textbooks, U.S. and world history textbooks, religion and world history textbooks, and religion and world geography textbooks. If we know our textbooks are biased, why do we use them? Well, most teachers don't even realize what they're teaching may not be necessarily true, as they were probably taught the same things. Parents may not even be aware of the textbooks their children are being taught with are filled with biased and inaccurate information, or what they are even learning altogether. Although textbooks are not always making up lies, they can sometimes leave out important information on purpose in order to bring forth their own opinion. Michael H. Romanowski, who was made a whole website about false history and the bias in textbook history, says, quote, by the careful choice of what facts to include or exclude, it's possible to construct arguments that can be wholly one-sided, yet can be asserted to fit the facts. Textbooks are influenced by political, ideological, or moral beliefs of their authors. Usually these beliefs supports the status quo or conventional understandings about its praiseworthy or blameworthy in history, end quote. So if a textbook accidentally adds something that may not be conventionally understood, their sales may decrease. When talking about decreasing sales, it is a big deal when it comes to the textbook industry, especially if the total worth of the textbook industry is $7 to $10 billion. In order for textbook companies to increase their sales, they must be able to sell to schools or directly to students. This may mean that sometimes in order to sell more, they may cater to certain places or states. For example, not to offend Southerners, the book may not go into the background of the Confederate flag in a fear that they might lose sales. Although this may make the consumer and the textbook publisher happy, it is not providing the truth that should be taught. Due to this process, the issue is not well known or publicized. If telling white lies proposed with leaving out information isn't enough, the way textbooks may describe events may leave negative or positive connotation about an event that should be seen otherwise. Romanowski continues, quote, regarding the treatment of African Americans, their economic advancement at the time of World War I, Bargan, McCutcheon, and Ritchie argued that all their discrimination against workers led to racist riots in 26 northern cities in 1917. African Americans in the North made a significant economic gains during the war. This sentence structure suggests that violence and racism against African Americans can be tolerated in exchange for economic gains. The word use of although to describe the racist riots reduces their reference to the racist violence to subordinate clause in the sentence, while the main part of the sentence stresses the importance of the African American situation. This deflects attention from a consideration of our democratic ideals and suggests that issues of discrimination and violence are less important than its economic gains. It's considered issues related to justice, equality, unimportant because blacks were rewarded with economic gains, quote, end quote. This is an example of a textbook companies trying to soften horrible events in the past, rewarding making the situation appear less important than others. Rewarding things is not always a bad thing when it comes to learning the actual material because it might be hard for some students to stick with the material, as Fitzgerald points out, mentioned in Renowski's article, Problems of Bias in History Textbooks. Quote, what sticks to memory from those textbooks is not particularly a series of facts, but an atmosphere, an impression, a tone. And this impression may be all the more influential just because one cannot remember the facts and the arguments that created it, end quote. This shows that making things actually wanting to be taught needs to be taught in the way that makes it interesting to the students in order for them to actually learn it and remember it. This may include in altering events in history, making it more biased than other depending the tone which is being taught. As McLaurin argues, quote, knowledge acquired in school or anywhere, for the matter, is never neutral or objective, but is ordered and structured in particular ways, end quote. What McLaurin explains that every single textbook is altered in a way that fits what the students should be taught, not what they need to be taught. As students continue to be taught with partial factual biased information, it can mislead them into getting the wrong idea about history. There are some reviews conducted in many history textbooks from religion to government by 10 scholars. Dr. Edward Countryman, a university distinguished professor in the William B. Clements Department of History at SMU, are among who conducted these reviews. The review of these history textbooks provide an explanation on what is wrong with some of the texts that are found in history textbooks. An example of these reviews, one was made on the text found in world history textbooks where it stated, quote, much of the violence you read or hear about in the Middle East is related to hijab, end quote. What's wrong with this statement, you may ask? Well, one scholar review explains that, quote, this broad change effectively blames Islam for a complex cycle of violence and counter-violence, a cycle driven by a host of factors besides radical Islam, end quote. This explanation shows how the statement can portray Islam negatively. Another review was on world cultures and geography, where the author states, quote, selfishness is the cause of suffering. In another discussion, they describe selfishness as a causing of suffering, end quote. A scholar then goes on explaining, quote, the first statement is incorrect and the second is misleading. According to Buddha, the cause of suffering is not selfishness but desire. Selfishness is one form of desire, end quote. This explanation shows how rewarding can affect the wrong idea, because rewarding does not only change the sentence itself in it but its meaning. This can lead to confusion and improper knowledge taught to the students. From your experience, do you find history textbooks used in classrooms to be biased?
It's funny you say that. When we adopt textbooks, when it's time for us to get new textbooks, all the textbook companies will give us an example of their book, and we'll go through them. Usually, the reason we don't choose other books is because they might be bent towards a certain topic, or maybe it doesn't quite tell the whole situation, or and yes, I mean, I think naturally the best textbooks minimize bias, but they all have bias. I think it's like the news media a little bit, right? They all are bent a little way, whether that's a newspaper, magazine, TV. I think they're all bent, but the ones that minimize it the least are probably your best textbooks.
Have you found any examples of biases in your textbooks used in classrooms?
Yeah, absolutely. It might be the view of a president versus just telling us facts about a president. They might lean towards, here are the awful things that this particular president did, where they don't do that with another one. There might be a situation where numbers have been exaggerated a little bit, and we'll have to go to legitimate sources and just talk about, the discrepancy, and I leave it up to the students. I think it's okay to have textbooks that are biased as long as the teacher just says, hey, this is one point of view, here's the other point of view. Not that the teacher's trying to push you either, right? We all have our personal bents, and again, the best teachers minimize that bias, and hopefully just make sure the students are aware. I don't think you can necessarily blame the textbooks, because that's, again, the teacher's job to prepare them for life. They're going to look at media, magazines, newspapers, and they are going to be bent. Look at the facts and form your own opinion. Don't just take somebody else's opinion as the truth.
Why do you think textbook companies provide bias or spin false narratives in textbooks?
Yeah, I don't think it's any negative reason. I think it's whatever's on their heart. Some companies have a heart for minorities, and that is all you're going to hear throughout that textbook is minority injustices, or where we've helped minorities, success stories, and those are awesome too. Or there's cases where a book company might be bent towards helping the poor, so you get all these stories about poor people and the sufferings they went through, and their successes. At the same time, they don't talk about people that worked really hard, went to school, got an education, started a business, and did really good things for our society because they're wealthy, as if it was a punishment. Again, I don't think they do it out of malice. I think it's just natural, like companies, the leaders of those companies have something on their heart that they want people to understand and focus on to help people. And I think that just comes out. I don't think textbooks do it on purpose, as some conspiracy theory to do harm. I think it's just their focus.
Do you think that history textbooks profit off being biased?
Yeah. Because not again, teachers get into teaching because they have their own things that they focus on, their priorities. I want to help make sure the people of America know blah, whatever it is. And especially in our subject matter, you have some freedom to expose things. And I think some teachers, if they're bent a certain way that a textbook might be, they're quick to adopt that textbook. Here, I try to adopt the one that's the least biased and let students just form their own opinions. I mean, I could care less where they go, left, right, middle, who cares? That's their job. Not my job to tell them how to think, but at least make them think.
Okay. Do you think it affects the way you teach, and if so, how?
I think that leads, that's a good segue to that subject. Because all textbooks are biased, including the one that I felt like was a good one, we still, again, have to tell all sides. I think the more that textbooks and social media, right, you can pick the friends and the media you listen to, and that's all you hear. You need to hear both sides. You need to be friends with both sides. You need to, if you were to look at my Twitter account, CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, Russia Today, Al Jazeera from the Middle East, like, you need to have all views and then try to form an opinion based on all facts, because sometimes biases, and it's not necessarily that they tell you one side, it's the fact they left out the other. You need to know what's going on. So how has that affected my teaching? I have to work really hard to try to bring in facts and data, and sometimes I just don't have the time to say, hey, here are both sides. You guys, what do you think? And I think our job as teachers is this biased? Well, yeah. Is this biased? Well, yeah. Okay, how could they make this unbiased? And then just try to teach students, just to be aware, be vigilant. I don't think it's bad for our country. Again, I think the reason people are biased is because that's what's on their heart and their mind to focus on, and they just don't either have the time or the resources to tell it all. Textbooks are we're talking a very small amount of information and time to put in a small book. You're going to have to pick and choose what you put in and to leave out. And if whatever's on your heart, if there's a theme within your company that you want to help, then I think, unfortunately, that's just going to happen. And it's just our job as teachers to try to undo some of that bias and just tell the whole story as best we can.
What do you think could be done to stop biasness in textbooks?
I don't know that you can stop it. We can just do the best we can. For us to make a statement that textbooks aren't biased is a false statement. They all are. And again, not for bad reasons. It's just natural. As much as I try to be unbiased, I'm fully aware that I am also biased. I just got to keep trying to do my best to not be. And I think we just, again, we have to do the best we can to continually check ourselves, right? Maybe I don't know the whole story. Man, I'm really passionate about this, but what about the other side? And I'll give you an example, like the Mexican-American War. We probably don't do a very good job in our textbooks to call out the United States government, right? That you lied, you started a war and took half the land. You, in Vietnam, lied that we were shot at on a boat in the Gulf of Tonkin. We've lied about our ship being blown up. We looked for weapons of mass destruction that we were told we were going to have in Iraq. Our textbooks don't talk about that. We probably should, right? And be honest about history, so that we are alert for future issues that occur where the government, not that, again, it's not a conspiracy theory or anything, but again, we need to be honest with ourselves in U.S. history that, hey, we've made some mistakes. Here's what we did, and just call it for what it is. Let the people decide what they want to do with that information, not necessarily tell kids America's fantastic, we never make mistakes, or that it's awful, because it's neither. It's somewhere in the middle.
Do you believe people should be aware of this problem, and why?
Yes, I think it's our job to teach them that. The fact that you're even talking about it's awesome. For us to be spoon-fed information and assume that it's 100% fact is a very dangerous place. Our society needs to be educated people that can think for themselves and not listen to a media person that's a specialist and just tell me how I'm supposed to think. No, that's my job. And I think it's important that we teach people to be self-thinkers and take their own stances. And when they take their own stances, they also come up with their own reasons to support a stance. And I think that's important. I think we have to do a better job of questioning everything, biases, stances, information, and then form our own opinions.
All right, thank you.
Are you aware that history textbooks can contain biased information?
I am aware. I've come across a couple times some biased information in my book. Like one time, our teacher, Mr. Pierce, he pointed out the Trail of Tears, for example. They said like over 1 billion people died, and really only like a couple thousand died, and so that's just exaggerated a couple to make us read it and be more interested when it's not really true.
What are your opinions on this?
I feel like biased information is sometimes interesting. You get your information from that is okay, but you have to definitely be careful how you base your opinions on it, because it's not fully true, and it's only based on one person's opinion and not the others. So you have to really be really careful on how you base your opinion, and don't go around telling people this is what happened, because it sometimes could be false.
Do you think this might affect your future, and if so, how?
Yeah, most definitely. On the news, will always be biased information. They'll always add extra numbers when there weren't extra numbers. Like, for instance, there could be a fire on the news, and they would say 4,000 people died, and really it was only 2. That's really sad, but it's not as drastic as 4,000 people dying. And if one day they put that in a history book, kids are going to read that and say, oh my gosh, 4,000 people died. That's crazy. That's sad. Why didn't they do something when really it was only like 2? And that's a huge difference.
Who do you think should be held responsible for fact-checking and researching the information in textbooks?
I definitely think that there should be someone held responsible, like someone with a doctorate, or like someone that has a degree in that kind of background, where they can check so they know the history and they don't get their history offline, because online it's always wrong, Google's never right, and so their information's not biased. And maybe they should have another person like read it, so it's not just one person's opinion.
With all this being said, it's important for people to be aware that some of the information being provided may not always be factual. It can give the wrong impression to certain groups of ethnicity, race, religion, etc. It's important to know our history and the mistakes made in those times in order to never repeat them. Knowing our history can help not only in history class, but in other subjects like business, science, math, law, etc. History is what explains where we come from and what we achieved over the years. Mark Owens wrote an article, Why Schools Have Stopped Teaching American History. It talks about how kids nowadays are being taught less or not enough history, and the author ends its article by, quote, we talk about often how fractured our country has become, that our division increases while kids are taught less and less about our shared history should come as no surprise, end quote. This quote explains on how history is less of an important subject that is becoming a problem in our society. History is an important subject that should be taught well and more of in schools, because the more we forget, the more likely we are to repeat those mistakes, creating conflicts in our world. A solution that can be formed in order to resolve this issue can be by educating teachers and making them aware of how textbooks sometimes provide wrong and biased information. Not only teachers, but students as well. Also, organizations or groups can be created for revision of history textbooks. Through these revision history textbooks then can be approved as school-worthy material. It can help stop false history in textbooks and be given it to schools and taught to students. The downside to this is that it may take time, money, and effort to create these organizations. Also, obstacles may interfere with organizations' creation by textbooks company themselves or the author of these history textbooks. Whatever the downside to these solutions, something must be done in order to help with the false history from spreading. After all, history contributes to our existence in this world, time, and generation, and it's important to get it right.